Today I'm going to do some excerpt reading and discussion on State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. Because this is a slightly longer text, I'm going to break it down by chapter: Class Society and the State, the experience of 1848 to 1851, experience of the Paris Commune of 1871, supplementary explanations by Engels, the economic basis of withering away of the state, and the vulgarization of Marxism by opportunists. This chapter's first section is about the fundamental role of the state. The very first paragraph of the text goes as follows. What is now happening to Marxist theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice and most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts were made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, as hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed class, with the objective of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting the revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur this doctrine of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of his theory, its revolutionary soul. They push the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Parentheses, don't laugh, exclamation point. After their death, attempts were made to convert them into harmless icons. This section really stood out to me as such an obviously relevant section to our current times. Just think about Martin Luther King, or a number of the Black Panthers, or Rosa Parks, or really a number of the people in the United States who have fought for liberation. Any class analysis is taken away when they die, and they are reverted to a liberal icon. Lenin goes on to write, and this is why I believe this is one of the first books you should read, that the most essential passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state must by all means be quoted as fully as possible, so the reader may form an independent opinion of the totality of the views of the founders of scientific socialism and of the evolution of these views, so that their distortion by the Trotskyism now prevailing may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. Basically, throughout this work, Lenin will quote Marx and Engels at some length, which will give the reader a lot of the primary information from Marx and Engels. In this, you get basically for free some of the most important excerpts of Marx and Engels, as well as Lenin's own analysis of them. So really, this is the best book that you could ask for. He writes, "The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled, and conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable." So basically, in line with Marx and Engels, what he's saying is that the state only exists when there are class antagonisms that can't otherwise be reconciled, and the existence of the state proves that these class antagonisms are irreconcilable. He then goes on to describe the first distortion. He writes, "On the one hand, the bourgeois, and particularly the petty bourgeois idealists, compelled under the weight of indisputable historical facts to admit that the state only exists when there are class antagonisms and a class struggle, quote, correct Marx in such a way to make it appear that the state is actually an organ for the reconciliation of the classes." But to refute this, Lenin quotes Marx. "According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by the other. It is the creation of, quote, order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, however, order means reconciliation of the classes, and not the oppression of one class by the other. To alleviate this conflict means that reconciling classes and not depriving the oppressed class of definite means of methods of struggle to overthrow their oppressors." So he talks about the creation of order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between the classes. So this moderation does not mean reconciliation. So the moderation means police cracking down on protests. That does not reconcile class antagonisms. It just makes them quieter. But while Kautsky theoretically accepts this, he refuses to accept that in order to liberate the oppressed classes, we must destroy the. Next, Lenin goes into the special bodies of armed men and prisons that constitute what state power really is. He writes, Engels elucidates the concept of power, which is called the state, a power which arose from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc., at their command. Now, as this special body of armed men is under the command of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, it naturally enforces their interests. On whether the special bodies of armed men can be anything else, he writes, it is impossible because civilized society is split up into antagonistic and moreover irreconcilably antagonistic classes, whose, quote, self-acting arming would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state arises, a special power is created, special bodies of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, shows us the naked class struggle, clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving the exploited classes instead of the exploiters. So basically, a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie will have a special body of armed men aimed at enforcing the will of the bourgeoisie, while a dictatorship of the proletariat, in struggling against the bourgeoisie, must have its own special body of armed men aimed at enforcing the proletariat's aims. In the next section, Lenin describes the state as an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed classes. He writes, because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict between the classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed classes. The ancient and feudal states were organs of the exploitation of the slaves and serfs. Likewise, the modern representative state is an instrument of the exploitation of wage labor by capital. By way of exception, however, periods occur in which the warring classes balance each other so nearly the state power is ostensible mediator acquires for a moment a certain degree of independence of both. Such were the absolute monarchies in the 17th and 18th century, Bonapartism of the First and Second Empires in France, and the Bismarck regime in Germany. In a democratic republic, Engels continues, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely. First, by means of the direct corruption of officials, America. Secondly, by the means of, quote, an alliance of the government and stock exchange, France and America. He goes on to write, another reason why the omnipotence of wealth is more certain in a democratic republic is that it does not depend on the defects of the political machinery or on the faulty political shell of capitalism. A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell, it establishes power so surely, so firmly, that no change in persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it. So to put this in plain English, if no change in persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it, can shake capitalism, this means that no matter what the ruling party is, whether for America it's the Republicans or Democrats or the Greens or the Libertarians or whatever else, no change in persons can shake it, which means that nobody that can be elected in a bourgeois republic is capable of challenging this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. He finishes this section by quoting Engels. The state, then, has not existed from all eternity. There have been societies that did without it, that had no idea of the state and state power. At a certain stage in economic development, which was necessarily bound up with the split of society into classes, the state became a necessity owing to this split. We are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes not only will have ceased to be a necessity, but will become a positive hindrance to production. They will fall as they rose at the earlier stage. Along with them, the state will inevitably fall. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of free and equal association of the producers, will put the whole machinery of the state where it will then belong, into the museums of antiques, by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. Lenin writes, "We do not often come across this passage in the propaganda and agitation literature of present-day social democrats. Even when we do come across it, it is mostly quoted in the same manner as one bows before an icon, i.e., it is done to show official respect to Engels, and no attempt is made to gauge the breadth and depth of the revolution that this, quote, relegating the whole machinery of the state to a museum of antiquities applies. In most cases, we do not even find an understanding of what Engels calls the state machine." Just another plug here for The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State by Engels. He really does a great job in that text of showing that, as quoted here, the origin of the state was necessarily bound up with the split of society into classes. He does a fantastic job of mapping it out. So one of the most famous quotes from Marx and Engels is about the, quote, withering away of the state. As soon as class antagonisms are finished and there's only one class, quote, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. This gives the measure to the value of a phrase. Next, Lenin talks about the, quote, withering away of the state and violent revolution. So he writes, "It is safe to say that of this argument of Engels, which is so remarkably rich in ideas, only one point has become an integral part of the socialist thought among modern socialist parties, namely that according to Marx, the state, quote, withers away as distinct from the anarchist doctrine of the abolition of the state. To prune Marxism to such an extent means reducing it to opportunism, for this interpretation only leaves a vague notion of a slow, even, gradual change, the absence of leaps and storms, of absence of revolution." When you look at withering away of the state from this opportunist lens, this bad metaphysical analysis of a slow, even, gradual change with the absence of leaps and storms, you're only thinking quantitatively, right? The growth or decay of the size of the state, not a qualitative leap and storm, not a revolution, which ends the state. But Lenin shows you that Engels did not want you to be confused. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletarian revolution abolishing the bourgeois state, while the words of the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, the bourgeois state is abolished by the proletariat in the course of revolution. What withers away after this revolution is the proletarian state or semi-state. So, while Marxists believe in the withering away of the proletarian state, unlike some social democrats or democratic socialists, we do not believe that the bourgeois state can be anything but abolished. Lenin goes on to quote Engels about the special coercive forces that are possessed by the ruling class in each epoch. He writes, "And from it follows that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, of millions of working people by a handful of the rich, must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is precisely what is meant by abolition of the state as the state. This is precisely the act of taking possession the means of production in the name of society. And it is self-evident that such a replacement of one (bourgeois special force) by the other (proletarian special force) cannot take place in the form of withering away." Thirdly, in speaking of the state withering away, and the even more graphic and colorful dying down on itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitively to the period after, quote, "the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society," end quote. That is, after the socialist revolution, we all know that the political form of the state at that time will be the most complete democracy. But it never enters the head of any opportunists who shamefully distort Marxism that Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy, quote, "dying down on itself," or withering away. That seems strange at first sight, but it is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also as being a state, and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state, the state in general, i.e., the most complete democracy can only wither away. In this, Lenin, through Engels, shows that as long as class antagonisms exist, special agents of coercion will exist. So the proletariat is currently oppressed by the arm of the state, by the bourgeoisie, but after the revolution, it has been shown experimentally that the bourgeoisie will still persist for some time, and they must be oppressed by these special arms of the state, by the proletariat. He also talks about democracy in a very interesting way. So the most complete democracy can only, quote, wither away. Obviously, as democracy is part of the political state, that as the political state dies down on itself, democracy as part of it will also die down. As the state will no longer be a political instrument at all, just an administrator of things, there will be no need for democracy, no need to address political aims or advance political lines in a non-political administrative entity. At the end of this section, Lenin describes the violent betrayal of Marx and Engels' theory, by the now prevailing social chauvinist and Kautskyite trends expresses itself strikingly in both these trends, ignoring such propaganda and agitation, i.e., about the need for revolution. The supersession of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without revolution. The abolition of the proletarian state, i.e., of the state in general, is impossible except through the process of withering. A detailed and concrete elaboration of these views was given by Marx and Engels when they studied each particular revolutionary situation, when they analyzed the lessons of the experience of each particular revolution. We shall now pass to this, undoubtedly the most important part of their theory.